It is my great pleasure today to have Lizzie McLeod from Nature Conservancy speak to us. She is lead of the global reef ecosystem. And a few words on her work. Her research focuses on building the resilience of coastal communities and ecosystem to climate change. And she has worked on conservation projects across the Pacific, modeling the impacts of climate change, conducting reef assessment, developing research priorities and management recommendations for climate change, blue carbon, ocean acidification, and developing and applying frameworks to assess community vulnerability to climate change. So without further introduction, I want to thank you, Lizzie, for coming online and providing a webinar. Again, the format is you're going to be giving your talk, and then we have two students who are going to lead a conversation and discussion following your talk. So with that said, I'm going to mute myself and let you do the talking. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manu, and thanks everybody for listening in today. As Manu said, I'm Lizzie, and I'm really excited to talk to you a little bit about our work at the Nature Conservancy and a lot of the work that our partners are doing around the world to help coral reefs. So I wanted to give a talk today that highlights the scientific evidence of hope. There's a lot of doom and gloom out there that I'm sure many of you have heard with coral reefs, and they certainly face some very serious challenges, but I believe that there are a lot of signs and that we do have the tools in our toolkit to actually to make sure that they survive this century and beyond. So I want to talk about that today. To start, I'd like to just briefly give an overview of how climate change is affecting coral reef systems globally. The greatest impact from climate change is actually from ocean warming, and it causes thermal stress in the corals, which causes a response that's often referred to as coral bleaching. And the corals basically turn white. They lose their algae that gives them their color, and you see that bare skeleton. And that's one of the most significant effects that climate change is having globally. But there's also sea level rise, which can cause sedimentation, which can smother coral. There are changes in storm patterns and rainfall, and storms can actually break the structure of the reef, and changes in rainfall patterns can release pollutants and sedimentation into the coastal zone, which can not only smother reefs, but actually create algal blooms. And algae can actually outcompete coral for settlement space. There's changes in ocean currents, and then also ocean acidification, which decreases growth rates, and it can actually make a weaker coral skeleton so that they're more brittle and vulnerable to breakage. So this is a graph that I want to share. This is actually just came out last year from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And what I want you to notice about this is looking just at warming. And it's looking at warming of 1 degree, 1.5 degrees, and 2 degrees. So if you can see the gray bar, the gray horizontal bar going across. And the color purple represents really significant impacts and irreversibility. And they're looking at a range of ecosystems, regions, and sectors. And what I want you to notice from this is really that coral reefs are the most significantly affected from ocean warming compared to these other areas, with Arctic following kind of closely behind. So very vulnerable to ocean warming. But in addition to that, there is a suite of other impacts facing corals, and this graphic just shows some of those challenges. And a take home from this one is really to notice that impacts are happening to corals from the individual coral in very small scales to the global scale, and also over different time scales. So an anchor damage would be you could damage a reef in a very discrete place, and it would be an immediate event, whereas we have cumulative stressors that are also occurring over years and decades, such as climate change, changes in ocean chemistry, and also some El Nino events. And so the idea here is just to see that corals are struggling with a suite of impacts that are occurring over different spatial and temporal scales. This is a graphic that I think really clearly shows, it shows the process of coral bleaching, but it also shows the time scale. This is a reef in American Samoa, and if you'll notice on the left, you can see really healthy coral in 2014, in just a few months, these corals are completely bleached, and you're seeing again that white coral skeleton. And then just later that year, they're completely covered in algae. And so the point here is really to show that this process can happen quite quickly. And if the water stays too hot for too long, then the corals die and they're not able to recover. In 1998, there was a mass bleaching event that led to 16% of the world's coral loss. And then there were subsequent mass bleaching events after that. There was another in 2010. And then the third bleaching event, it's referred to as the longest, most widespread, and most destructive, actually happened over a 3-year period. It received a lot of press. Many of you may have read about it in papers. You may have read the Great Barrier Reef lost half of its coral, or 30% of the world's coral suffered widespread bleaching and mortality. This was a significant global event, and it really demonstrates that not only can we have these global impacts of coral bleaching, but that they're happening more frequently, which means that there's less time for recovery. So that is the kind of the state of play for corals. Those are some of the challenges that they're facing. I am an internal optimist. I am definitely a cup half full person, which is why I do what I do. And I wanted to pivot in the talk now to talk about all of the different things that organizations like the Nature Conservancy, our other conservation partners, communities around the world, and scientists are doing to try to make sure that coral reefs have a future. So this is a slide that just shows some examples of some of the local management actions. In the top left, you can see there's a diver that's actually skewered a crown of thorns starfish, which is sort of a reddish color here in the picture, and they're putting them in bags and they're collecting them off the reef because these are corallivores. They actually eat the coral. And if you look in the foreground of that picture, you can actually see a little bit of white on that table coral. That's where that crown of thorns has just been munching. In small numbers, they don't do that much damage, but they can actually reach outbreak densities. And they can actually eat entire sections of reef. And so particularly places like Australia and some parts of the Pacific, they have divers that go out and actually harvest them, pull them off the reef to prevent their damage. We also put a lot of strategies in place to manage water quality. On the bottom left, you can see a big sediment plume coming out of a river. Particularly after you've had heavy rains, you can have some significant impacts in the coastal zone. So we'll do things like revegetating coastlines. We'll put in coastal vegetative buffers in stream banks and rivers to catch sediments, mangroves that can help catch sediments and pollution coming into the coastal zone, and also just stormwater management and pollution management, reducing agricultural runoff and other pollutants into the coral reef systems. In the middle graphic, that's a picture of a protected area network. This is actually in West Papua in Indonesia, where you see the hatched lines. Those are areas that are protected from fishing and also from different destructive techniques like dynamite fishing, and they are areas where they also try to improve the water quality in those places as well. On the top right, you see a picture of fish that are munching algae on a reef, and herbivore protection is also another key strategy for helping coral reefs to be better able to recover. They graze back to algae, which creates settlement space for coral. And so if those populations of fish get too low, you might see algal overgrowth, and then you have a loss in your coral or less opportunities for coral to recover and grow. The picture below that is a dynamite, where fishermen sometimes use dynamite to get fish off the reef, and it essentially leaves big blast craters and damages the corals. So putting in legislation in place that blocks that is important. And then at the bottom, there's a picture of some coral restoration projects, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So I talked about this, the scientific evidence for hope. You know, this isn't just hoping for the best and putting strategies in place, but we have data that actually shows that our actions can and do make a difference. This is a study that was Mellon et al. In 2016 in Australia. And what they did is they basically looked at corals within marine protected areas and then corals outside the MPAs. And they showed that the reef community composition was actually 20 to 40% more stable in the MPA. The disturbances were lower, and the recovery was 20% faster. So basically showing the power of these protected areas to help corals recover. So a caveat to this study is there was another study that was done a year later by Hughes et al. That actually showed that during that mass bleaching event that I talked about before, water quality and fishing pressure had really little effect on the bleaching, which basically means that if that thermal stress event, if that water gets too hot for too long, even the best managed reefs can still succumb to bleaching. So there are limits to what these management actions can do, even though we have the evidence to show that they can support improved coral health and recovery. So I want to share, the next slide is a reef from Palau, and this is actually one of my favorite places in the world to dive, and it's also a place where we've really seen remarkable recovery. This is a reef called Lighthouse Reef in Palau. And in 1998, it was wiped out from the bleaching event and then completely recovered. And then in 2012, it was hit by a typhoon and the reef was reduced to rubble. And then just 6 years later, it's almost completely recovered again, and the fish populations have come back and recovered. So this is a well-protected reef. This is a reef where they're managing water quality, human impacts. They don't allow for any kind of destructive fishing. And the message here is, if we are keeping reefs as healthy as possible and there's time for them to recover, then these management effects and management actions can really help support reef recovery. This is another example from Palau, and this one is really interesting to me. This was one that was a study that we partnered with, but led by Woods Hole and the Palau International Coral Reef Center. And what they found is, at this place called Nico Bay, which is an enclosed bay in Palau, the reefs were actually thriving in highly acidified waters. And these were waters that we weren't even thinking corals could live in, and they weren't projected until 2100. And we found that in this area, they had really high coral cover and high diversity, which demonstrates that corals do have the capacity to adapt to changing conditions up to certain thresholds. And so this was a really interesting study showing their potential to adapt to acidification. So this last example I want to share is from Bonaire in the Caribbean. I know we often hear a lot about Caribbean reefs and losses in coral cover. And indeed, the regional studies that have been done show that, you know, in the 70s and 80s, it was over 30% coral cover, and it's dropped to, you know, between 10 and 20% in the late 1990s and early 2000s. But by difference, Bonaire is actually at 45% coral cover, which is really significantly higher than the surrounding areas. And the reasons for that are that these are reefs that have been managed for decades, and they've been managed really well. Spearfishing was banned in the 70s. They established a marine park. They started regular monitoring in the early 2000s. They banned catching parrotfish, and they phased out fish traps. And in the background, they've had bleaching events, like the 2010 bleaching event. They've had hurricanes, like 2008 hurricane damaged the reefs with significant declines in coral cover, but these corals have come back, and they've recovered to the pre-damage levels up to 45% in 2017 by the most recent surveys that were done at these sites. So this really demonstrates the power of local management actions, of managing your herbivores, and keeping water quality healthy to give reefs the best chance of survival. So I want to switch now and talk a little bit about some of the technological advances that are out there, and really building on this idea that corals do have an inherent capacity to adapt up to a certain threshold. Assisted evolution is something that's gained a lot of interest, and it's also, I see it more and more in public news articles online. You'll read about super corals or super reefs. And the idea here is it's using selective breeding. So when you go out onto a reef, not all corals bleach equally, either across different species, but also even within the same species. Even corals sitting right next to one another, one might bleach whereas the other one doesn't. And so what the scientists are doing is they're taking those corals that are not bleaching, and they're taking them back to the lab, and they're breeding them to try to breed stronger offspring. They're also breeding this algae that live inside the coral tissue called zooxanthellae, and they'll breed them through multiple generations in the lab and try to select the most heat tolerant. They're using stress conditioning, so they're taking corals and zooxanthellae into the lab, and they're subjecting them to increases in temperature and acidification, and then again, they're selecting the strongest of these, and they're using them to outplant onto the reefs in restoration projects. They're using probiotics to actually increase corals' health resistance or health tolerance in recovery. And they're in some places moving corals, either moving corals from warm areas to cooler areas to accelerate thermal tolerance, or they're moving heat tolerant corals to areas with less resistant corals to put the resistant genes back into the population. And they do this sometimes during spawning events to try to get those strong genes shared through those coral reefs and spread, and hopefully leading to new corals with more heat tolerance in them. There's a technique that's fairly new that was developed by Dave Vaughn at Mote Marine Labs called microfragmentation. And this is a reef restoration technique where you actually intentionally break the coral. It was discovered by accident. Dave was, he was working on he had a nursery of coral offshore on a lab, and he basically accidentally broke a fragment of coral and then realized that it grew back way faster than the other fragments that he had. And so this led to this whole process of actually intentionally breaking corals into tiny fragments to stimulate their growth. And it can actually stimulate it 25 to 50% faster than their normal growth rates. So what they do is they break these corals and then grow them in nurseries. And then once they grow to size, they'll put them out on the reef to form the reefs. Another technique that they're using is based on the natural process of sexual reproduction in corals. And this is where scientists will actually go out and collect the coral. When they spawn, they release eggs and sperm, and they'll collect these and then take them back to the lab and fertilize them in the lab and then plant them back out onto the reef. And this is a method sometimes referred to as larval propagation, but it's really critical because it maintains genetic diversity, which is so important for keeping all of that diversity in the population, which helps to make it better able to cope with different types of stress. So I want to switch now. This is an initiative. This is a reef restoration project. This is actually being led by Mars, which is a very famous, they sell pet food, they sell candy bars. You probably all had different products that they've developed. They are actually leading reef restoration projects in Indonesia and I believe also the Caribbean and Mexico. And they designed these, they call them spiders, and they dip them in, they put a resin and a sand coating, which encourages coral settlement. And then they put them out onto the reef. So this is an example in Indonesia. You can see the diver, they're actually using zip ties to tie them together and putting little coral fragments on them, which can then grow and recover. And so you can see within 3 years, you have just tremendous recovery in this particular reef in Indonesia. So this is a technique. Here is an example. This is the blasted reef. This is where they've used dynamite and they've just devastated the reef. And they put these spiders in. And then with just 18 months later, you can see the reef is completely recovered. And you can actually, if you look carefully between the corals, you can actually see those spider structures, those white structures in between. But just really tremendous recovery here. And again, important to note that good water quality, good access to recruitment, coral settlement potential, all of the factors that enable success and recovery are present in this place. If you have poor water quality and you have dynamite going on, you're not going to see this level of recovery. So it really is contingent upon having the right enabling conditions. Another key part of enabling conditions are also national and global policies. Probably one of the most famous is the Paris Agreement, where we're agreeing to hold temperatures to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with an ambitious target of trying to limit them to 1.5 degrees. There's also the HE targets, which are specifically for coral reefs. And it's all about controlling and reducing the human impacts, the anthropogenic pressures on reefs. And then there's national policies, things like coastal zone management. And these are all really important to try to help keep coral to support coral restoration. I get up in the morning. Who are the people that motivate me and keep me fueled and fired? These are some of my ocean heroes. They range from conservationists to scientists to policymakers, presidents, and they are all people who have committed their lives to the oceans and some of them to coral reef conservation and have inspired me in my work. And then finally, the next generation, and this is perhaps the most critical. I think, you guys are actually the ones who are going to be helping us get through the next decade where we get emissions under control. There was a recent survey of Gen Zers, and it was across, I think, 20 countries. And they found that 40% said climate change is their #1 priority. And I just thought that was incredibly heartening. And I read another article that was saying that millennials and Gen Zs represent almost half of the US population. And for me, that means you have a critical impact on politics and getting the right legislation in place to support increased and sped up accelerated action on climate change. And I do believe if we continue and expand our conservation efforts, if we get emissions under control, we can absolutely secure a future for coral reefs.